All right. Hey, it's the weekly roundup. And for the first time, this is sort of a newsy version of the weekly roundup. I'm David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect. I'm here in Bucks County, Pennsylvania for the weekend. And I have been monitoring this vote regarding the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the reauthorization of a particular section of that allows for spying on foreign nationals. This spying creates a large database, and caught up in that dragnet are often U.S. persons. And the FBI has been found to have abused that on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of occasions, to engage in warrantless spying on American citizens for purposes that are not related to foreign intelligence gathering operations. So there was an amendment that was put together, a bipartisan amendment uh, by Andy Biggs on the Republican side, Pramila Jayapal on the Democratic side. Yesterday, the Congressional Progressive Caucus said that they would endorse it. That requires a 2/3 vote of the caucus, so that at least built in something like 70 votes on the Democratic side. They just held the vote, and it ended up as a tie, 212 to 212. That was the vote on the amendment. And the amendment was to force, anytime U.S. citizens were being queried in that search database, that a warrant would have to be obtained in order to conduct that query. When there is a tie on amendments in the House of Representatives, that means that that motion is not adopted. That amendment is not adopted. And so, despite a 212-212 tie, that amendment does not go into the reauthorization bill. And now we have a whole host of questions. What we saw on the floor is that Democrats were more against the amendment, Republicans more for it. The administration was lobbying heavily against this amendment. Merrick Garland and Jake Sullivan were talking to members, according to published reports, telling them to vote against this amendment. There were a lot of, frankly, lies that were put out there about this amendment, claiming that it would end all foreign intelligence gathering when it had nothing to do with foreign intelligence gathering. It was solely about getting warrants for U.S. person searches, caught up in that dragnet. But all of those efforts led to a 212-212 tie, which then votes down the motion, the amendment, to force a warrant on these particular situations. And so now we move to other amendments that are being conducted for the bill, some of which might pass, some of which might not. And then there's the question of the actual final legislation, and whether those 212 members that really wanted the ability to gather a warrant in order, on U.S. persons to prevent this abuse of the system, are they going to reauthorize the FISA program, the Section 702, this particular part of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, without that warrant provision? This has been a source of problems for weeks, actually over a year now, within the House. Just this week, there was an attempt to vote on a rule to get this particular set of votes on the floor. That rule was voted against. It was initially a 5-year reauthorization of FISA. They then changed it to a 2-year reauthorization. That was an attempt to satiate pro-Trump Republicans by telling them, well, Trump will have an opportunity if and when he wins the election. He'll have an opportunity to reform this particular surveillance program. So they allowed the vote to go forward today. I just told you about the amendment, but the question is the final vote. There were many members in the debate portion of this that said, if that warrant is not in there, we can't pass this bill. There are some cosmetic reforms that were put in by the House Intelligence Committee. In one instance, it actually expands government surveillance. Those 212 members have a choice to make. They have to decide whether or not it's worth it to continue forward on this legislation. Now, there are other amendments that the Intelligence Committee has put together that actually would expand government surveillance even further, and we have to see if those amendments are going to be voted up or down. This is happening right now on the floor of the U.S. House. I can't say I was incredibly surprised by the failure of the warrant amendment. I'm a little surprised on how close it was. The fact that it was a 212-212 tie means there's just substantial support to rein in the abuses of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. But there is also the usual fear mongering that goes on whenever government surveillance programs are attempted to be changed or reformed in any way. We're going to have Luke Goldstein, our writing fellow, who has anchored our coverage of FISA. He is here right now. Luke, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going? Sorry, I'm a little late.
I see you're coming from the prospect offices there. This is an incredible turn of events. I've been talking about the failure of the warrant amendment by a 212-212 count, an actual tie that then means that the amendment was not adopted. I've been talking a little bit about what has happened throughout the week, but maybe you can give us a little more background on this FISA fight and why that amendment vote is so shocking.
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite an eventful morning on the Capitol here in Washington. I guess some of the backstory about this vote, just to touch on this, I don't know exactly what you covered, but if you look at the vote splits, there were some really important margins on both the Republican and Democratic side. The White House and various intelligence authorities were actually calling up individual offices this morning. They put out a whole public letter as well, telling every member why they should be voting no for specific.
It was a statement of administration policy, which is standard that they put that out. What is not as standard is them actually lobbying individual offices.
Calling them up on the phones.
That was the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and maybe others who were actually calling members and telling them to vote no on this warrant amendment.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and, sort of to be, expected. I mean, they've been opposing the amendment the whole time. But as you said, it's very unusual for them to actually, be calling up offices individually. And I think we saw that reflected in the vote totals that are coming in. There's not an official roll call, so we can't see for individual members how they voted, but
we'll get it pretty soon. Yeah. I mean, we'll get that roll call pretty soon. I can say that just now an amendment from Chip Roy was adopted. I'm not familiar with what these amendments refer to, but and an amendment just now from Dan Crenshaw was adopted, which is probably more ominous because that amendment is probably an Intelligence Committee amendment that was just adopted. So, what we had is that there was this kind of process where there was a base bill, and that base bill largely reflected the House Intelligence Committee's version of FISA reform, and not the House Judiciary's competing version, which was far more of a reform. And then there are additional amendments, some from the Judiciary Committee side and some from the Intelligence Committee side, that would actually expand government surveillance. The question is, what's going to end up in this final bill? And then the second question is, are those 212 members who were really, really interested in adding a warrant for U.S. person backdoor searches, what are they going to do on the final bill? And is it going to be enough of them vote against it to block that bill? Because, a tie may have gone to the Intelligence Committee on blocking the amendment. But if you have a tie on the final bill, that means the bill is not adopted. So if you had the same vote on the amendment that you have on the bill, the bill wouldn't go forward.
Yeah, that's right. I don't want to speak too broadly about this, but there are a number of privacy groups already that are urging members, especially the ones who are in favor of the warrant requirement reform, to vote against the compromise bill text now. The group Epic put out a statement yesterday that was, kind of charting out this scenario and made that pretty explicitly clear. So I think it really does come down in some regards to what the Congressional Progressive Caucus decides to do about this. They put out,
and keep in mind, there were members on the other side of this, members aligned with the Intelligence Committee's version of the bill, who said, if the warrant amendment goes in, I can't vote for this bill. I mean, they made it very explicit on their side. People like
on
Dan
the House
Gold,
floor.
Yeah, on the House floor, made it very explicit. And so the question is, will the pro-reform side return the favor? I am skeptical that you will get particularly Democrats, that you will get all of them to vote against the base bill. And if that's the case, then you probably aren't going to be able to stop this bill. But stranger things have happened, certainly.
That's right. I mean, so the main change, I guess, just to give some people a little bit of a backstory of what happened this week, the main change for this bill that's currently being voted on is the FISA reauthorization here will sunset in 2 years, not in 5 years, as it usually is and originally was supposed to. So I think that change was made to try and, assuage members that, we can basically compromise on this vote here, and we'll, kick the can down the road, or just decide.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, as I said before you got on, I think it was specifically targeted at folks who were with the Freedom Caucus to say, well, look, give us 2 years, and then under President Trump in his second term, we will fix it. And that seemed to be enough, because, earlier this week, as you wrote about, a rule was blocked. And, this week or today, that rule wasn't blocked. Now they're voting. There was a vote on an amendment by Representative Waltz that just passed. And now there's a vote on an amendment from Representative Turner. And, it's hard to say exactly, but it looks like that's going to pass as well. So I feel like this bill is actually getting worse. There are amendments from the Intelligence Committee that seem to be carrying the day, which makes it all the more questionable as to whether those 212 members who voted for a warrant are now going to back a bill that not only is not the reform that they wanted, but is actually even worse.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's been kind of so wild about the fight this time around. I mean, just so people know, there's been several FISA reauthorization fights over basically the past decade. This one's really kind of crazy in that the reformers had probably more momentum than they've ever had behind them before. They came obviously really close to passing this warrant requirement. But also, on the other hand, there is a chance that the way this whole fight ends up, it will lead to actually a further expansion of surveillance powers. And it's a little bit hard to say which amendments right now refer to what reforms, but in my reporting, there are essentially 3 changes that the Intelligence Committee is trying to make to the base text here that is being voted on, right now as we speak. One is to expand the language in FISA Section 702 so that intelligence can go after, drug trafficking, essentially, but it's a very broad definition. It would basically be the, kind of trafficking of any substance under the Controlled Substances Act. The second one is about immigration. So intelligence could do warrantless searches on, any subject, any individual who is just traveling to the U.S., which I think it has to be probably just stated to remind people is not actually a crime. There's lots of legal ways that you can travel to the U.S. That you probably couldn't legally get a warrant out. And then the third one expands the language and definitions for the companies that intelligence can sort of compel to hand over information. And this one is the one that kind of reformers are most up in arms about. It would let the government basically seize data center information and even landlords, office buildings. There's a lot of stuff that would be kind of,
Right.
unearthed here if
Well,
this
it
went into
it
effect.
seems to me like all of those have passed because this Turner
Yeah.
Amendment is about to pass in a second. And let's actually go back and say what wasn't given the opportunity for an amendment, and that is something called, that would fix what is called the data broker loophole. So, could you explain that that part of this and how that didn't even get the opportunity to be voted on?
Yeah. So, yeah, just to step back here, this fight going back to last year, the reformers have wanted really two main fixes. One is the warrant requirement, which we've gone over, and then the other one is this data broker loophole, which is
Mm-hmm.
there's some technical things here. It's not technically part of FISA 702. They were using FISA 702 in order to fix this
Got it.
loophole that's directly related. And I mean, this is just a practice that's developed over the past 10 years where the government has been able to essentially compel various data brokers and other companies to hand over information that can include information on Americans as well. And so, to close that, reformers were really pushing in December and February to get that language in here. It was originally going to be available for a floor vote, but what happened with this fight compared to February was Speaker Johnson changed the language of the base compromise text that all these amendments are then voted on top of, took out the language for commercial information that would have allowed the data broker amendment to go to the floor. So that's just completely
made it not germane. I mean, let's keep in mind, like when you're dealing with legislation in the House and amendments, what's in that base bill is very important because what's in that base bill isn't going to change. You can add things onto it like they're doing right now, but by and large, that base bill isn't going to change. And that base bill, what ended up in there this time, as opposed to the last time that Speaker Mike Johnson tried to pass this, nullified the ability for that data broker loophole to be closed. And so, really, I mean, this has been an odyssey since the Patriot Act. We've really seen a very familiar pattern every time government surveillance has attempted to be reformed. The reformers come up with some using copious amounts of evidence, usually abuses in these programs. The intelligence community says these programs are absolutely totally necessary, and if you change them by one iota, we're all going to be killed in our beds by terrorists. And eventually Congress relents. And that's how it's been for 20 years, since the Patriot Act was put in place after 9/11. And even though the pro-reform caucus was clearly bigger than ever this time, they were not able to make the sale. They were not able to quite get it done. And they're going to end up with a worse bill than the status quo.
Yeah. And just one more point here to add on. So in terms of, how the compromise bill could actually end up leading to an expansion of surveillance powers, it's not just that Speaker Johnson took out the language that would have allowed for this data broker loophole fix. Mm-hmm. It actually added another provision that I think, our listeners will probably be hearing a lot about in the coming weeks, depending on how this develops. They added a provision that allows members of Congress to be notified if there is a query put into this giant database of information and data that the government has collected through FISA 702. So members of Congress get notified if there's a search on them without a warrant, but not the American people, not
exactly. And I just want to update that they're voting on final passage right now. And by the early returns here, it certainly looks like they're going to vote final passage pretty easily. Democrats are overwhelmingly voting for this. Republicans are a little bit more split, but I think we're nearing the case. And actually, if you just stick around here for a second, We're already 196 votes in favor. There seems to be no question this is going to pass Congress, and that this House bill now that has to go to the Senate, of course, where there are a lot of civil libertarians, Ron Wyden among them, and maybe they'll mount an effort to put in some sort of reform in there. But it already has the amount of votes necessary for threshold in the House. So this bill is going to pass the House with all these amendments that you described. And now the game goes to the Senate, where I mean, I think the expectation in the Senate, given the supermajority threshold, is that they're probably going to pass this along. There's a deadline of April 19th for this FISA program. Section 702 expires next Friday, a week from today. But that's ample time for the Senate to dispose of this, and I expect it to be signed by the president. Go ahead.
I mean, I just want to give people a little bit of a sense of the stakes here. I'm in some group chats with the privacy reformers who are talking to members on the Hill, and they're pretty pissed. I'm not going to attribute who this quote is, but someone just said they just handed Trump the backdoor search, immigrant targeting, as we went over, and Patriot Act 2.0. So that's the kind of level of, I think, anger.
This is what's just happened. I mean, privacy experts, advocates, surveillance reform, civil rights groups, they've been working on this for a long, long time. They were really lied about on the floor of the House today by Intelligence Committee members. Their aims were distorted. Even with all that, they ended up getting 212 votes for the one amendment they were able to get on the floor. And it just came up literally one vote short, with several members not voting. And now they're in this position where the whatever administration, whether it's this one or the incoming one, has a lot more surveillance powers now, if this is indeed going to pass the Senate.
Right. Yeah. And one other just thing that I think flagged for people is that the members of the Intelligence Committee and intelligence officials have used, as you've laid out, a number of scare tactics about, mainly kind of threats abroad, terrorist groups that are plotting, whatever kinds of.
Even though the warrant amendment was solely about U.S. person searches, it had nothing to do with foreign.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a distraction, fear tactic. But there was a big story that did play a role in this fight leading up to votes today, which is that Wired put out a report that they had obtained information from one of these classified intelligence briefings that the Intelligence Committee has used to try and influence members right ahead of a vote on FISA and the various reforms. Just a small sidebar here. Speaker Johnson, who has flipped on the warrant requirement, used to be a supporter of it, and this time around was not, credited one of these classified intelligence briefings for opening his eyes, I guess. It's amazing what these briefings can do, I suppose, once you're speaker.
And we'll see what because it wasn't only Johnson who flipped here, but Hakeem Jeffries, who had also voted for this, for a warrant in theory in the past. We don't have the actual vote totals, but he certainly expressed support for this version of FISA, right?
Yes, that's right. I'm very curious to see what the vote totals are. I have a little bit of a personal investment in this, but so Nancy Pelosi as well had in the past voted for a warrant requirement, and we know flipped on this one because she spoke on the floor against it.
She spoke on the floor, and in remarks where, among other things, she said that if FISA Section 702 was in place on 9/11, it would have saved everybody, which is a highly dubious claim that seems to contradict the 9/11 report, which said that the intelligence was available, just nobody in government connected the dots. So
that's right.
This is the kind of rhetoric that you hear when one of these key programs has to be extended or reauthorized. You hear things like this is about the lives of Americans. This is about preventing another 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. And it's usually just very rhetorically heated and overstated. And I think that's also what we saw today. And unfortunately, it was just enough to get this over the finish line.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, I think the authoritarian tendencies that were on display on the floor this morning were pretty shocking. I wanted to just finish this one point. So the Wired report, there have been all these, there are scare tactics about foreign threats that are kind of disingenuous because it's not totally related to what the reformers are pushing for. There was a story that in these briefings, Mike Turner specifically made an issue to put up slides about a anti-war protest that happened this fall in New York City against Israel's actions in Gaza. And the insinuation was that the protesters had some connection to Hamas. And this was based on a pretty dubious report in a right-wing news outlet that, is just not confirmed, especially by the standards of if you're a congressional member. And, the issue about this report is that this is also not really what FISA authorizes intelligence authorities to do, even based on just what the law currently is.
Right.
This would have really extended what their powers
they're stretching the powers to say that now, because we assert some connection between anti-war activists and Hamas, that we now have the authority to look into communications that we think could catch. I mean, is that really what we're talking about here?
To look into protesters who are merely engaging in.
So now we're talking about American citizen. We're talking about American citizen protesters engaging their peaceable right to assemble and their free speech rights under the First Amendment. And now Mike Turner, in a briefing, the guy who wrote this bill that just passed and who wrote the amendments that just expanded it, says, we have the right to go after them. We have the right to look at their communications. I mean, the idea that this is solely about foreign intelligence gathering is just completely dubious.
Right. And that story was really important because these were the people who were participating in this protest that, Turner was trying to make an example of. Those are constituents of really key members, congressional representatives in this fight. I mean, that's Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader. That's Jerry Nadler as well on the Judiciary Committee. Chuck Schumer.
Nadler's the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and he along with Jim Jordan, Nadler's the ranking Democrat, and Jim Jordan is the chair, and they together supported a reform version of this that included the Warren
On this vote,
amendment.
The yeas are 273.
There it is.
Sorry. 147.
That's all right. Play it.
The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
273 to 147. Now you can get rid of it.
There you go. Sorry, that was an accident, but
but that was a happy accident because now we have just broadcast live that 273 to 147. The FISA reauthorization for 2 years has passed the House of Representatives. It moves on now to the Senate, and we will see what happens there. But I expect that something similar will happen, especially now they've essentially jammed the Senate, right? Because there's only a week left, and this expires. Even though that's not a real. Let's talk about that. That's not a real deadline. And explain why that even if nothing happened between now, like the Senate went out of session, didn't come back, there would still be the opportunity to get to have these various programs work.
Yeah, I mean, intelligence kind of wants to have their cake and eat it too here. So they preemptively got a year-long extension for the court orders essentially that allow them to use these FISA 702 information requests. So this deadline in April that's coming up is essentially artificial. The administration intelligence could continue for a full year using 702. powers if there had been reforms that would have been triggered after
but
that. to reauthorize
to reauthorize the program, even if technically it's expired in statute. So there's just a host of things going on here. It was actually really fortuitous that it was happening all right now. But certainly not the outcome that civil liberties advocates wanted. And I wouldn't expect that outcome to improve at all in the Senate, though, happy to be wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and again, the year-long extension sounds kind of technical or procedural, but it just matters in terms of, as we've discussed here, whether reformers and certain Democrats, perhaps with Freedom Caucus members, would be willing to put pressure on the Senate to see if they could block this. But they're going to be under tremendous pressure from intelligence, who says if this expires, there's going to be a imminent national security threat. Yeah.
Expect the exact same calls from the exact same administration officials, this time to senators, saying, you got to pass this, you got to pass this, you got to pass this. So, in many ways, a replay of what we've seen really since 2001 in terms of this intelligence community programs. Let's try to cheer ourselves by talking about anything else than this. We're about halfway through the show. This is Prospect Weekly Roundup. I'm here with Luke Goldstein, writing fellow for The Prospect. I'm David Dayen, executive editor. Another thing that hold on a second. I should put him live on. This is David Siegel, but he would not be happy with me if I put him on live.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call him back. But anyway, so there's another thing that we actually teamed up on early this week, and we've gotten some developments on it that we haven't put at the Prospect. And by the way, I think Luke is working on sort of a wrap up of all this FISA stuff that you'll be able to read at prospect.org pretty soon. But
here's my assignment. First I'm hearing it.
I don't think it's the first, actually, if you want to correct the record there.
There have been murmurs.
Well, we'll ask questions for the record later. So we wrote about some machinations, once again, bipartisan machinations, these on behalf of large corporations at the House Antitrust Subcommittee earlier in the week. Regarding a pretty obscure, pretty wonky operation that the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division is trying to put together. Could you explain, let's first say, what are the FTC and DOJ trying to do? And then we can talk about what the House Antitrust Committee has been trying to do to counteract that, and then what we think the actual result is going to be.
Yeah, so the main substance here is that one of the Department of Justice, Federal Trade Commission's biggest achievements has been to issue these new merger guidelines, which, again, like, it sounds very legalistic, but basically what this amounts to, and we covered this, it's like a new corporate charter that essentially tells companies, gives them, sort of guidance about like how you can grow, and that what the bottom line for this is you have to actually innovate to grow. You can't just merge and buy up your competitors, or you're going to be subject to much stronger enforcement from regulators. These guidelines, kind of reasserted the agency department's, powers to block these kinds of deals. There is a separate rule that the Federal Trade Commission is working on right now, which is called the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, which is, sort of a complement to the merger guideline review. It sort of, it kind of buttresses them essentially. And it basically just requires, companies that are merging to,
I am going to stop you there because I did just get some information about, we don't have the roll call on the FISA vote, on the warrant amendment yet. However, according to sources, uh, three of the defections, three of the members, who I believe are all Progressive Caucus members. And remember, the Progressive Caucus formally endorsed the warrant amendment. So these three Progressive Caucus members ended up voting against the amendment. Ted Lieu, who is my congressman from California, maybe not that surprising because he's a member of leadership. Joe Neguse, who's a member of the Judiciary Committee, and Jamie Raskin, all voted against the warrant amendment. They're all members of the Progressive Caucus. Lieu and Neguse, at least, are members of the Judiciary Committee, which voted in committee for a FISA reform that included the warrant amendment by a count of 35-2. And I'm pretty sure Lieu and Neguse voted for that in committee and voted against the amendments on the floor. I hate to give you more work here, Luke, but you're going to have some phone calls to make to those three members to try to explain why they abandoned not only their principles but their past votes.
Yeah, they're going to have to come up with some creative ways other than saying the White House gave us a call and, told us we should switch our vote. Yeah. I know that Joe Neguse in the past had, this might be true for all three of them. I just know for Neguse, he had voted for a warrant requirement on the floor in previous fights. So this is
right.
Full
I would be surprised if Lieu and Raskin didn't.
Right.
I don't have the figures in front of me, but I would be surprised if they didn't. So anyway, that's a postscript there, and we'll have more at prospect.org. All right, let's go back to what we were talking about. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Hart-Scott-Rodino Antitrust Improvements Act, that really is one of the last antitrust bills that we have passed in this country. We're really operating off of 19th century laws, but Hart-Scott-Rodino basically says, okay, you big company are going to merge with somebody, and that merger, the value of that merger is above a certain threshold, you have to let the antitrust authorities know, you have to notify them that you're conducting this merger and give them an opportunity to review it. What's in question here is how they notify, how these companies notify the FTC and the DOJ, depending on the jurisdiction, how they notify those agencies about what they're about to do with respect to a merger. Why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, they're very basic legalistic questions, but they do really help. They really help regulatory antitrust authorities. Just, there's so many mergers and acquisitions per year, so it just helps them sift out which ones they really need to look into and not. And the reason, most people probably haven't heard of this rule is that it's not one of the biggest, priorities. It's not something that's been, covered a lot, but companies really care about this rule.
And let's explain why. Because it would basically say that companies have to give real, actual information to the FTC and DOJ in order to conduct a merger. Now, in the past, with the current form, they don't have to give a whole lot of information about the merger in terms of, what the relevant market is, in terms of, what they're meaning to do, in terms of what mergers they have engaged in the past, in terms of a whole host of things. So what happens right now is that if the FTC gets a case and they get a Hart-Scott-Rodino form and somebody's merging, what they have to do is conduct a whole bunch of research in order to figure out what the heck's going on in this particular market. And the changes to this form would mean they wouldn't have to do any of that. The company would have to, by law, give them that information. And then they can use that information to make a credible case as to whether or not this merger should go forward or not. So it's a huge deal because right now, the agencies are caught up in busy work, just trying to figure out what the hell's going on, rather than doing their job, which is assessing the market conditions, the market structure, and deciding whether or not to agree to a merger.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so there's an antitrust, a big conference that's here in DC, and I, snuck my way into one of the panels that was talking about these laws, and someone from the Federal Trade Commission was just kind of, laying out in plain language what this is about. And if you're an official at the FTC, the way he described is there's kind of a black box for what companies are really planning, what kinds of negotiations have happened, and the paperwork is really just aimed at trying to shine some light on what the companies are actually thinking about before, regulators decide if they're going to intervene. It just cuts out some of the busy work. But for companies and their lawyers, I think they seem to believe that, a lot of paperwork is a nuisance to them and that they shouldn't be obligated to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's move then to what the House Antitrust Subcommittee did or attempted to do to counteract this. There was a briefing that was held on Monday. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that briefing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so you've reported on this more than me, but the backstory is that the Antitrust Subcommittee used to be, really quite dogged on this issue when it was led by David Cicilline, congressman from Rhode Island, who recently retired. There was a huge report put out in 2020 covering mainly the big tech companies, but it was like really a seminal project. And now it's being run by Lou Correa, who's a congressman from California, home to Silicon Valley and, other tech companies, and Thomas Massie, who's, kind of a more libertarian, oriented guy. He's pretty hostile to any government regulations. So what they did is they held this briefing that's just for staff members. And, we caught wind of this briefing. We were curious, because it's about the merger guidelines and the rule we just talked about, HSR, Hart-Scott-Rodino. We were curious, what kinds of panelists are they bringing on to inform staff, and why,
And by the way, they were specifically saying, we're going to discuss the FTC and DOJ antitrust, merger guidelines, and Hart-Scott-Rodino. So you would think that of the FTC or members of the Antitrust Division and Justice Department would be well equipped to answer questions and explain what was going on with their particular operations. Now, were any FTC or DOJ members invited to this briefing?
No, they were not.
Right.
And also the timing is kind of what piqued our interest about this too.
Right.
These rules have been out there for a while. Why were they holding this briefing now?
So and who was invited to the brief? Who was briefing staff of the House Judiciary Committee about these new rules?
Yeah, so they invited Maureen Olhausen, who was a former commissioner and chair of the Federal Trade Commission, who was a Trump appointee. She was the chair under the Trump administration. Since leaving, she has gone to work for some private sector clients, which include, through the law firm she works for, Google, and then she is personally represented.
Well, the law firm is Wilson Sonsini, which is practically Google's law firm. I mean, we don't have indications that Olhausen works for Google, but we do know that she's worked for, what was it, Amazon?
Amazon and Facebook. Personally.
Amazon and Facebook. That's right.
Consulting and legal services.
And her firm certainly makes tons of money from Google. And I believe she is a partner. So that means she makes money from Google.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I mean, her work for Amazon and Facebook were related to antitrust actions, investigations, such, not just unrelated. That's her expertise,
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, she was, the main panelist. So, I mean, that stands out immediately. And then there were two private sector people.
The two others were like private sector CEOs that seemingly didn't have much interest or understanding of antitrust laws.
Self-admitted. Yeah.
So we got a readout of this briefing. We had somebody in the room that told us information. We heard it was a poorly attended briefing, I should mention. But they said that it was basically towing the corporate line on that. This is an incredible burden on companies to have to give all this information to the FTC and to the DOJ, and this would, chill important transactions and make it much harder for the American economy to grow. Is that a fair assessment of what they said?
Yeah, it's a jobs killer, David.
It's a jobs killer. It's a
All
jobs
the
killer.
legal work and paperwork is going to take away jobs from, people who
So that
should be earning it. Yeah.
so that was on Monday, but let's now fast forward, because at the American Bar Association spring conference on antitrust that you attended, there were some more indications that leaked out about what the now this is the kind of thing, the HSR form, where you have to put out a proposed rule. This is administrative procedure, standard stuff. You propose it, you get comments, public comments, and then you put out a final rule. So we're at the stage where they've gotten the comments, but they haven't put out the final rule to change the form. And so what we heard today, or just yesterday, I believe, at the ABA, it was regarding what the final form would look like. And why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, and that all just made much more clear what the timing of this briefing was, which had been, a little a little bit unclear to us. So there had been reports, and it seemed that people in the legal world were all fairly well aware of this, that the final rule for Hart-Scott-Rodino Act was supposed to actually come this week. So that briefing last week was, a kind of final warning call, essentially, for the antitrust subcommittee to kind of, I think, express their disapproval and maybe influence what happened there. So we then got a report from Law 360, a trade publication, that the Federal Trade Commission has decided to make some changes to what was initially proposed for these rules. And based on some statements that have come out from Lou Correa, it seems that they're more favorable to what he and, industry would like. They're a little bit watered down. We have to see what they look like, but that's just based on these initial.
Yeah, so Correa comes out, and I'll read it. He came out with this particular statement where he says, "I welcome the reported decision by the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division to release more reasonable and balanced Hart-Scott-Rodino Act pre-merger notification form requirements that will not create undue burdens on American companies, especially small businesses." Now, the small business part is actually hysterical here, because the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act gives a threshold where smaller companies don't have to report. Small transactions don't have to be reported here. So, the invocation of small businesses is absurd. So that was a really bad sign that Correa was saying that. And then you were at an actual panel where you got an even worse sign, if you want to describe that.
Yeah, I mean, so this claim that the original rules were going to be too burdensome for smaller companies was the main talking point echoed at this briefing that we reported on, the House briefing, from everything that we've gathered from people there, and including from someone like Maureen Olhausen, who represents large tech companies. Everyone is kind of singing the praise and the struggles of smaller companies. So I was at this panel at the Antitrust Bar Association conference, but one comment really stood out. There is the in-house legal counsel for Novartis, which is a very large pharmaceutical company. I'm sure people have heard of this. And the HSR rules come up, and someone mentions they've heard that the FTC is choosing to go a little bit of a different direction and maybe, water them down somewhat. And he was very pleased to hear this. And the first thing out of his mouth was, "I'm so glad, because all these small companies would have really struggled with the new paperwork." He's representing Novartis. So I think that's kind of a dead giveaway here of, what's really going on and who was actually scared about this.
Super disingenuous. Now, I mean, maybe the charitable interpretation here is that there are some changes made that aren't really material, but they make everybody feel better, and everybody can say we won and walk away.
Yeah.
I mean, that's certainly not impossible. We don't have the final rule. We don't have the final notification form. And so we can't say intelligently exactly what's in it. We're inferring because corporate forces are really, really happy. It could be that they made some cosmetic changes and the corporate interests are trying to put the best face on it. But I think there's a low probability of that. I think they probably made some legitimate changes here.
Well, let's just plant our flag here. What's really on our radar about these rules is one of the requirements, new requirements that was going to be added for the paperwork, was loathed by specifically private equity because it said that you have to list all of your essentially transactions, acquisitions over 5 years, I believe it is, which is typically how roll-ups in private equity work. And those can be much smaller scale. So if you have members who are, saying these rules are going to be less burdensome for smaller transactions, that could be what was left out of the final rules here. So we'll just be monitoring that.
Absolutely. I have more breaking news. This is a hell of a breaking news show. The roll call for the vote on the warrant amendment is now live, and I am giving it to Mr. Goldstein right now in our chat here. And so you can see the 212 roll call. We're going to have to run down it to see exactly who voted no and who voted yes. I already see it on the Democratic side. Jeffries voted no. Gabe Amo, who was with the Biden administration, voted no. Andy Kim, who is running for Senate in New Jersey, voted no. Colin Allred, who was running for Senate in Texas, voted no. We're going to have to run down this. Obviously, we only have 5 more minutes here. We're not going to give a full list of who voted yes and who voted no, but you can go to house.gov and find this. It's a lot of people you would expect, but it's some people you wouldn't expect. Now, talk about the fact that Hakeem Jeffries, voted no on this. And by the way, I would say that it was pretty unanimous among the House leadership. Luis Aguilar and Catherine Clark also voted against the amendment. The House leadership was pretty unilaterally opposed to this particular amendment. But talk about Jeffries in particular.
Catherine Clark as well.
Catherine Clark. Is that what I said? Yeah, I think that's what I said.
No. I'm saying she voted no as well, just to add her name to us. Yeah.
And Pelosi.
I'll be very petty for a moment here. So I reported, I put out a story earlier this week that was giving the rundown on the fight on Tuesday. There was a rule for a floor vote that got killed. It was a little bit of a minor victory at the time, which is what led to the votes today. So there had been numerous staffers on the Hill who had told me that Speaker Johnson said that he was going to vote no on this warrant requirement on Thursday, and that also Minority Leader Jeffries was going to vote no, based on a sort of behind closed door meeting that members had. And that's a big deal because Jeffries has actually been part of the reformers in the past. He has numerous registered votes for this versions of this warrant requirement, backdoor search fix, among other reforms, even the data broker loophole, I believe. So Senator Mike Lee had actually publicly said this, that Johnson and Jeffries were going to vote no for the warrant requirement, which is a big deal because this is, it kind of sets the tempo for the rest of the caucus. And they did, by the way. And the speaker doesn't always vote, by the way. Usually doesn't vote at all. Yeah. But Johnson did vote no, and that's the deciding vote. Yeah, it's an important signifier. And so I had reported this in our piece, and I had reached out to Jeffries' office many times to try and figure out what they were thinking about this whole fight and how they were going to vote. And I never got a response until they didn't like something that was in my story, and they reached out and they said, this is incorrect. They said that Senator Mike Lee was lying, and that these members did not speak for the minority leader. So I asked them, so is Jeffries is he committing to vote for the warrant requirement on Thursday? And they wouldn't comment on whether or not this happened. So I mean, I just think this, think it's a little shocking. I mean, they were calling a senator and numerous House staffers liars, and they actually weren't lying.
It turns out they weren't lying. They weren't lying at all. Just to put my petty cards on the table on this amendment, Adam Schiff, running for Senate in California, voted against the amendment. Katie Porter and Barbara Lee, who also ran for Senate and lost in California, voted for it. So thanks, California. Appreciate your help there. And to all that say that these things don't really matter. I mean, as long as you pick a Democrat, these fights don't really matter. These primary things are distractions. They do matter. They matter a great deal. And I'll pique your interest by saying that David Trone voted against the amendment, the Warren amendment. He's running for Senate in Maryland. These things do matter. Literally any single vote would have changed the outcome here. Any flip from no to yes would have changed the outcome on this particular vote, which has enormous implications for our civil liberties. And it didn't happen. And so, if we will leave you with something today, it's that policy matters and candidates matter. Rosa DeLauro also voted no on this amendment. Interesting. And I'm sure there are a lot more, but anyway. Okay, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Luke, for a very breaking newsy kind of prospect weekly roundup here.
It's just what we do.
It's what we do. Good stuff. So we're going to record this and have it up on the website a little later today. You can listen in. We are working on turning this into a podcast that you can then take away with you and listen to wherever you get your podcast. Look out for that in the next week or two. And next week, I will not be here. I will be at a conference on Friday at the normal time. But we have Mo Tkachuk, who's going to have a special guest. And that should be a good one that you won't want to miss. So thank you all, and we'll see you next week on the Weekly Roundup. Thanks, Luke.
Yep.
All right. Take care.